big issues that comes out of the floods is around how we rebuild Durban to be better, how we prepare for climate change. Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudi is a professor who looks at climate changes at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor, good afternoon to you. When we start to rebuild what has been so badly damaged in Durban, where do we start? What kind of structures do we need to build?
Okay, thanks very much. That's a very good question. I think part of rebuilding is understanding what has, made this situation or into a disaster, and seeing then how we can address those problematic areas. So in this current situation, we have several moving pieces. There's the issue of developing our early warning system capabilities, taking them down to the community level. There's the issue of building capacity within the disaster management services so that they are better able to respond and mitigate disasters. There are issues that are related to revising our spatial planning laws so that the conflict between the built environment and the ecological infrastructure is managed. A great deal of the challenge was brought about because of excessive runoff being generated from hard surfaces, because of an excessive amount of concrete surfaces, some of it illegal and so forth. So there's a need for an integrated approach in informing the strategy to how we rebuild from these floods.
A lot of it is also about where people live. So if you, for example, if you were to drive from, say, parts of the Drakensberg in KZN through down to Durban itself or down to the coast, you will drive through a very hilly area. And on almost every hill on that stretch of highway, it's a big national road, you will see people living. Now, people are living, people would rather live in a flat area if they could. I would suggest it's much easier to build on. You don't have to go up and down all the time. People are building there because there's nowhere else. So that's one of the major problems why, in particular, Durban is such a problem, but also, if I'm correct, also why we have floods like this, because why we have storms like this, because of the geography, the physical geography of that area.
Yes. So there are two things that you have raised. One is around the issue of informal settlements. And by their very nature, because they are informal, they often mushroom up in places that are not zoned as being residential. So they'll usually mushroom in low-lying areas where there's a river close by, which people can use as, for access to water. Or they'll be on very steep slopes, which are, regularly not zoned as residential. And of course, building on steep slopes puts you at risk of landslides, which is what we have seen in this particular instance. Also, the fact that a lot of those structures are not planned, so there's no proper design, there's no proper drainage, stormwater drainage in those places. So then when there is, heavy rainfall and infiltration and so forth, you see the sort of subsidence that you've seen, collapsing and landslides. You have people who are settling in, low-lying areas, which are riparian zones, which are flood-prone. So when there is a flood, naturally, those people would be affected. So that's an issue of informal settlements and people moving into the cities and there being no alternative accommodation, to accommodate these people within the city, because it's growing rapidly. So that's something that has to be managed, the issue of accommodation and also managing influx of people into the city spaces. The geography of Durban or eThekwini is, it's a natural feature that we have, that we've got the mountainous landscapes rising as you are moving from the coast inland. And in this particular situation, that worsened or intensified the rainfall, because whilst we had the low pressure system that was moving across, the warm air that was coming in through from the Indian Ocean then produced that orographic effect as it rose, on the mountain slopes, condensing, and then increasing the amount of rainfall that we were receiving. So the fact that also you have that, and you've got people who are now in those slopes, and you've got people in the low-lying areas, which are naturally going to be downstream, then puts those people further at risk of being affected by floods.
So, I mean, what we have then is we have a situation, where Durban in particular is so hit by this. I mean, you can't really move a whole city. And we focus on what we need to do differently, but are there some things that we just need to do on a daily basis? I raised this point earlier today because I think it's so important. We need, for example, to make sure that storm water drains are clear, they don't have plastic in them, and they work.
Yeah, so we need to have a plan, and that plan has to have phases, which are short-term, immediate, and those are the things that you're talking about, the things that we can do now. And the things that we can do now are maintaining the existing infrastructure, ensuring that the stormwater drainage is clean. We are not putting dirt and solid waste in them, which would block them in the event of flooding and create localized flooding. We need to stop building illegal buildings or creating illegal concrete surfaces, which then increase, the area of concrete versus the area of natural grasslands, which is supposed to create a buffer in terms when there's rainfall and aiding the runoff and infiltration. We need to also stop illegal structures. And those are things that we can do. Those are things that are in our hands that we can do, in the immediate. There are things that in the medium term, we need to be working on modernizing the designs to flood risk management, modernizing stormwater drainage, taking into consideration climate change and the increased risk of, floods, and ensuring that the infrastructure that is being developed now and put into certain places is climate resilient. And then long term, we need to think around revising the whole spatial planning laws and ensuring, because it's inevitable. What we know is that by 2050, the majority of people are going to live in cities. So the movement of people into urban areas is inevitable. Urbanization is inevitable, but we need to manage that so that, it does not create a new problem, which, as we've seen now, what we're seeing. But if it is carefully managed, if we manage the green spaces, if we manage the areas that are zoned for flood attenuation and do not build in those areas, if we rehabilitate damaged ecosystems, if we carry out reforestation programs, which are some things that are happening already, but in small pockets. But if we were to focus on those things in the long term, they would build the nature's capacity, to attenuate floods. And then, of course, the built infrastructure would also complement the natural capacity to attenuate floods. And the revising of spatial planning would ensure that we do not have settlements of people within the areas that are, at high risk of flooding or on, steep slopes where there's a risk of landslides.
And Professor, you're an expert on climate change. We expect floods like this maybe once over every 50 years. We had one in the late 1980s. Do you think we're going to have floods like this more often? Could they, I hate to ask this, Professor, but could they even be worse in the future?
Okay, so the current floods, we cannot attribute them to climate change. We can attribute them to weather and increasing weather variability. But broadly speaking, what we understand of climate change is that specifically in KZN, there is a prediction that there's a likelihood of increased storms and floods. So, and there's also increasing variability. And with increasing variability, it means that the frequency and intensity are going to increase. So there's nothing to say there won't be another one next year. There's nothing to say that intensity won't be worse. As we have seen comparing 2019 and what we have seen this time, definitely 2022 was more intense than what we experienced in 2019. So that's a likely scenario that we should actively prepare for.
Professor, I really appreciate the time. Thank you. Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudi, an expert on climate change at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So thank you very much indeed. Well.